Hello all, and welcome to video number 2, where we'll be talking about medieval economy and society, video number 2 for chapter 20. And for the first slide here, we're going to be discussing economic expansion. Now, economic expansion in the Middle Ages really centers on agricultural expansion. Now, there are several factors that contribute to the expansion of farming and agricultural output. One is more farmland. By the late 10th century, forest and swampland was being converted on a very large scale into arable, fancy word for farming land. A lot of nobles resisted this at first because they wanted it for their hunting land, but they eventually realized that the more farmland means more money and kind of better lifestyle for everybody. Another is better farming techniques. You've got your classic crop field rotation with the 3-field rotation. We've talked about that in the past. Introduction of new crops such as beans. It sounds kind of silly, but, legumes and beans, they provide, a very kind of stable and high protein, source in people's diet. Also, the increased domestication of animals. This all leads to an increase in production. Additionally, new tools, water mills, heavy plows as well, better plows. Not only better plows for oxen, but also the horseshoe and the horse collar. It leads to a greater output. It allows beasts of burden to work for longer periods of time. It puts more of the pressure on their shoulders and their chests as opposed to choking them around the neck. It also leads, to kind of an increased output for transportation as well. So all of this increased agricultural output is going to result in more food. And what do we always talk about with more food? It leads to more people. So you see a population growth as well. And what also always goes hand in hand with the population growth, urbanization. Growing urban centers leads to more urban jobs, right? You see all of these kind of, urban centers that you've got in medieval Europe. You look at where the vast majority of them are, the highest concentration are down here in northern Italy. Okay, and a lot of that is just because of the trade that you see coming down here. But you also have kind of a scattering throughout central and northern Europe as well. London is pretty much the only one you got up in England. You do have some up in northern Germany. Paris is growing into a larger city. Some of these other ones, Cordoba, Toledo, Seville, those were cities even under Muslim control, and now that they've been reclaimed by the Reconquista, they're continuing to expand because of trade also. So, but in any event, these kind of growing urban centers with urban jobs, such as artisans, merchants especially, they're mostly developing along trade routes. And this revival of trade, this revival of urbanization that you see, it goes hand in hand. Italian city-states really dominated Mediterranean trade. No kind of surprise there, right? All these trade routes that are coming in through the Mediterranean, especially a lot coming in from the Middle East after the Crusades. So these are going to be dominated by cities like Venice in particular, Florence, Genoa, Milan, and so forth. And also this leads to the expansion of business for Italian merchants. They start to push farther into Asia, such as the Polo brothers, right? We know about Marco, but it was really his uncle and his father that really set up shop in Constantinople and then built these trade routes through Central Asia and eventually led all the way to the Far East. Okay, northern trade was a bit different. Northern trade was dominated by the Hanseatic League. Now, the Hanseatic League was an association of trade cities in northern and central Europe. Okay, this would go all the way into northern England, in today's Scotland, such as Edinburgh, but London became the major hub throughout this area. Let me erase these. And you notice that they did go down south. It wasn't that they had no contact whatsoever, but obviously, they would want to do business with the Italian city-states, but in terms of control, this was where their control really was. You see the associated cities and so forth. It went, center mostly in Germany, but there were some up in Scandinavia, and they would go all the way into what today would be present-day Russia, of Novgorod and so forth. So the Hanseatic League, they were a very important trade network that existed in medieval Europe. So some social changes. European society was traditionally broken down in what became known as the 3 estates. Okay, for the 3 estates, you've got those who pray, the clergy, those who fight, which are the nobility. Remember, knights were a member of the nobility. Okay, knights, we don't associate it with like grunt soldiers. It costs money to get this armor. It costs money to be trained as a knight. So even the noblemen, they were a member of the warrior aristocracy. And then you have those who work. which are the peasants, which is basically everybody. Right, so make sure you remember this. This notion of 3 estates is going to come up again and again. It'll be especially important when we talk about the French Revolution in a couple of months. But clergy, nobles, peasants. And as you would imagine, the first two, okay, clergy is the first, nobles are the second, they had significantly higher status than the third. But you do start to see some changes that develop, and a lot of this is due to the urbanization. You see development of independent cities. Urbanization led to more job specialization, as we just mentioned on the previous slide. So not everybody fell into the bottom peasant category. Towns and cities didn't fit neatly into the old social order. Consequently, cities became increasingly independent from the control of aristocratic lords. These noblemen, their wealth and status was based on land ownership. Cities were not really a part of that old order, that old scheme. And they began to become increasingly independent of the old order. They would draft charters that would give them their own rules and regulations, and they basically just started to govern their own affairs. Changes in the working class within these cities were exemplified in the importance of guilds. Guilds, are associations of workers. They regulated industry. They also provided a sense of social identity as well, similar to the jati of the caste system. Yes, they regulated prices and made sure that, competition was regulated and things of that nature, but they became the source of social centers, of family connections. It was very similar in some ways to the caste system. Not quite as strict because it wasn't tied into religion, but there was internal regulation within medieval Europe of guilds, similar that we saw in the jati system in India. And lastly, the role of women. The status of rural women out in the countryside was largely unchanged. They were working out in the fields and were required for, the more female duties. Cities offered more opportunities. Now, it's important to remember that Europe was still a patriarchal society. So political participation was off limits, and women were still expected to be faithful wives and mothers and so forth. But they could work as craftsmen and merchants. They were allowed to join guilds. It was not uncommon for women to run businesses, sometimes to possibly even own businesses. It varied from region to region, but it did happen. So you started to see some slow, and I keep in mind, I emphasize slow progress of women in urban centers. Okay, so that wraps it up. Quick video for this one, and in the next video we will discuss Christianity in medieval Europe.